There were big barrels, small barrels, barrels to the left and right of him, barrels in front of him, and barrels which seemed to be piled almost as high as the eye could see. In fact, there were so many he soon became dizzy trying to count them. "You don't have to scrub them all," said the foreman encouragingly. "Only as many as you can. We pay 5 pence each for the big ones, 2 pence for the smalls, so the more you clean, the more you earn. It's what we call piecework." 5 pence each, repeated Paddington, hardly able to believe his ears. He'd once scrubbed out Mr Brown's water butt at Windsor Gardens. It had taken him most of one weekend, but at least at the end of it, Mr Brown had given him 10 pence extra bun money. "I think perhaps I'd like to try my paw in the testing department instead," he exclaimed. The foreman gave him a look. "You'll be lucky," he said. "You have to work your way up to a job like that. Your best plan is to start at the bottom." He pointed towards the corner of the yard as he turned to go. "There's a brush in that bucket over there, and you'll find a hosepipe in the corner. Only no playing about squirting people. There's a famous film star coming to make this footprint in the ceremonial cement today, and if I catch you wandering about, it'll be straight back to the job centre, and no mistake." Paddington stared after the foreman as he disappeared through the open gates. In the past, he had often found there were days when things seemed to go wrong for no reason at all, but he couldn't remember a day when things had gone quite so badly. In fact, they had not only gone badly, but they seemed to be getting steadily worse with every passing minute. He gave a deep sigh as he looked round the yard at all the barrels, and then gradually a thoughtful expression came over his face. He felt sure that when the Browns arrived later in the afternoon, things would begin to sort themselves out. But in the meantime, he wasn't the sort of bear to let a good opportunity slip through his paws. Paddington believed in making the most of things, and it wasn't often he was allowed to play with a hosepipe, let alone be paid to do so, even if it was only 5 pence a large barrel. A few moments later, the steady hiss of escaping water began to mingle with the distant roar from the factory, and shortly after that the sound of rolling barrels added itself to the general noises as Paddington went about his task. Several times during the next hour the foreman poked his head round the gates to see how things were going, and on the last occasion he brought the gatekeeper along as well. "We've got a good lad there," he said approvingly. "Makes a change from some of the layabouts we've been getting lately." The gatekeeper surveyed the small figure inside the yard. He said darkly. "You see something else that's going to need a good hose down before the day's out." He nodded towards the factory square, where a large crowd had assembled in readiness for the ceremony. "I only hope he doesn't show himself in front of that lot. Sir Huntley will be making his speech any moment now, and he won't want no young bears covered in wet chunks roaming about." The gatekeeper addressed his last remarks in a loud voice towards the yard, but Paddington was much too busy to notice what was going on outside. Working in a marmalade factory was a lot more enjoyable than he had expected. Already most of the small 2-penny barrels had been cleaned and stacked neatly to one side, and he was feeling very pleased with himself as he sat on his suitcase and made a careful note of the number on a piece of label from an old jar. As the foreman and the gatekeeper hurried back across the square, Paddington took a long drink of cocoa from his thermos flask and then turned his attention to the huge mound of 5-penny barrels at the back of the yard. He looked at them doubtfully. Cleaning the 2-penny barrels had been fairly easy. Apart from the odd few with particularly difficult chunks stuck to the bottom, it had been mostly a matter of climbing inside and splashing about with the hose-pipe. But the 5-penny ones looked much more difficult. Not only were they a lot bigger, but as far as he could see, there wasn't even so much as a pair of steps in sight, let alone a ladder which would enable him to reach the topmost ones. Laying the hosepipe on the ground, he picked up a long piece of wood and poked it between the 2 barrels at the bottom of the pile. Things had happened so quickly earlier in the day he hadn't been able to take it all in, but he distinctly remembered the foreman advising him that the best place of all to start in a marmalade factory was at the bottom. As he levered the wood to and fro, several loud rumbling noises came from somewhere overhead. Paddington wasn't too keen on thunder, and he looked anxiously up at the sky as he quickened his pace. Some of the claps sounded much too close for his liking, and he wanted to get as much work as possible done before the storm finally broke. Had he but known it, Paddington wasn't the only one to feel uneasy about the sudden change in the weather. From his position on the platform, Sir Huntley Martin himself cast several glances skywards as he tried to speak. Although it was a warm day for the time of year, thunder in February was most unusual, and he didn't like the look of things at all. "'Pon my soul," he boomed into the microphone, "that's all we need. Sir Huntley Martin was beginning to look more and more unhappy at the way things were going. The day had started badly when the famous film star who had promised to perform the opening ceremony had fallen ill, and now to have a thunderstorm in the bargain seemed the final straw. Several times he tried to continue with his speech, but each time he opened his mouth, a loud rumble came from somewhere near at hand. Even the audience began to look uneasy, and from her position in the front row, Mrs. Bird placed her umbrella at the ready. "I wish someone would tell me where Paddington has got to," she said. "I knew he should have bought his mackintosh." "If you ask me," said Mr. Brown, "he's probably still inside the factory digging into the marmalade store." "If he doesn't hurry up," said Mrs. Brown, "he'll miss the ceremony, and he'll be most upset if that happens." Mr. Brown turned his attention back to the platform. "If this thunder gets any worse," he said, "there won't be any ceremony to miss." "Crikey!" exclaimed Jonathan suddenly, pointing across the square towards the yard. "Look!" "Good heavens!" boomed Sir Huntley, following the direction of Jonathan's hand. "It isn't thunder at all, it's barrels!" Everyone stared in amazement as they took in the sight which met their eyes. Several barrels were already bumping their way across the square towards them, and even as Sir Huntley spoke, a number of others detached themselves from the top of the pile in the yard and fell with a loud crash to the ground. "Look out!" shouted the foreman. "The whole lot's going in a minute." Almost before the words were out of his mouth, the rumble became a roar, and before the astonished gaze of the onlookers, the mountain of barrels collapsed and came cascading out through the yard gates. Most of them stopped some distance away, but several bounced dangerously near to the audience, and one in particular seemed to have a life of its own as it spun round a number of times and finally ended up with a loud crash against the side of the platform. "Mercy me!" cried Mrs. Bird as a familiar hat, followed by some equally familiar whiskers, peered out of the wreckage. "It's Paddington!" "That's the young bear I took on this morning!" exclaimed the foreman with surprise. "The young bear you took on?" repeated Sir Huntley, looking as if he could hardly believe his ears. "But he is one of my guests! Thank goodness you're safe, Bear," he continued, stepping down from the platform. "I don't know what's gone wrong, but I should never have forgiven myself if you'd had a nasty accident on my premises." "What a blessing you had the presence of mind to get inside one of the barrels," said Mrs. Bird. "Otherwise there's no knowing what might have happened." "Oh, I was inside already, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I heard some claps, so I climbed inside in case I got struck by a bolt." "But what on earth happened?" asked Sir Huntley. "I think I started at the bottom by mistake," said Paddington sadly, as he rose to his feet and dusted himself. He felt very much as if he'd been for a ride on a helter-skelter, a scenic railway and a dodgem car all rolled into one, and now that he was actually standing it seemed even worse, for his paws felt as if they were sinking deeper and deeper into the ground with every step. "Careful!" cried Mrs. Brown. "Mind Sir Huntley's ceremonial cement." "Sir Huntley's ceremonial cement?" echoed Paddington, looking most surprised as he peered down at his feet. Sir Huntley Martin stepped forward hastily and lifted Paddington carefully out of the small square of wet concrete. "I think, ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, holding up his hands for silence, "this is a good moment to declare our new factory extension well and truly open. After all," he added amid applause, "lots of factories in the world have been opened by film stars making their footprints in the cement outside, but I don't suppose there are many that can boast some genuine bear's paw marks." As the applause died away, Paddington examined the patch of cement again with interest. "I could make a few more marks, if you like, Sir Huntley," he said hopefully. "Bears are good at paw marks." "Thank you, Bear," replied Sir Huntley tactfully, "but I think we have enough to be going on with. Enough's as good as a feast. And talking of feasts," he added, looking at his watch, "we're already late for tea, and we don't want to miss that. We've made some special new director's marmalade in honour of the occasion." "Director's marmalade!" exclaimed Paddington with interest. "I don't think I've tasted any of that before." "More chunks," said Sir Huntley confidentially, as he led Paddington across the square towards the main building. "I'd very much like your opinion on it, Bear." Mrs. Bird looked at the others as they followed on behind, picking their way through the maze of broken barrels. "I know bears usually fall on their feet," she said, "but it takes a bear like Paddington to land slap bang in the middle of a patch of ceremonial concrete." "And get a reward of some special director's marmalade to test into the bargain," said Judy. "Don't forget that."